Welcome back to the Making International Inquiry video series. In this video, I'll be explaining on Peace Declaration, Framework Act on Peace, Framework Act on the Management on the 5 islands in the West Sea. The waters around the 5 islands in the West Sea, including the Northern Limit Line (NLL), are overlapping waters between North and South Korea and China, so that there is a controversy about its status under the international law. There is also the risk of conflicting jurisdiction. Illegal fishing by Chinese vessels is rampant in these undelimited waters. It is an area where complicated issues exist between South Korea, North Korea, and China. This area is governed by various domestic laws, but they have not adequately responded to the changing situation in Northeast Asia or domestic need. Some measures to protect the safety and protection of the people living in those dangerous islands are available under the Special Act on Support for the 5 Islands in the Republic of Korea in the Yellow Sea in order. However, this special act is a law, the purpose of which is to compensate losses from restricting the rights and interests for the region of security by recognizing the 5 island areas as a dispute area. Therefore, it is necessary to enact the law which relieves restrictions by turning this area into a maritime peace zone. In compliance with the principles of the Armistice Agreement, the enactment of the Framework Act is needed with underlying purpose of the achieving peace in the waters around the 5 islands in the West Sea by promoting inter-Korea exchange and cooperation and ensuring the rights and interests of the local residents for the implementation of the Declaration of Peace and Prosperity and Panmunjom Declaration. The legislating process for the waters around the 5 islands in the West Sea consists of the following: the Declaration for Peace in the West Sea, which upholds the basic spirit; the Framework Act on Peace in the waters around the 5 islands in the West Sea, based on a condition that there exists a legally binding agreement between South and North Korea; the Framework Act on the management of waters around the 5 islands in the West Sea, which can be a Framework Act on the management of waters around the 5 islands in the West Sea, which can be pushed at the South Korea's own initiative in cases there is no legally binding agreement between South and North Korea. Let me touch upon the Declaration for Peace in the West Sea. The Framework Act on Peace and Framework Act on Management are aimed at implementing the agreement reached by the leaders of the 2 Koreas through the Panmunjom Declaration. Some follow-up measures, such as the setting up areas for suspending maritime hostilities on artillery training, has been taken. However, the establishment of the Maritime Peace Zone and pilot the joint fishing area in the West Sea has yet to be implemented due to the conflict between position of South Korea's NLL and the North Korea's 12 nautical miles. In order to establish peace in the West Sea, it is imperative that forward-looking follow-up measures be taken by overcoming such obstacles. The follow-up process between the Koreas will only be possible based on the principles that can be mutually acceptable by both South and North Korea. In this context, the Armistice Agreement must be revisited. The Armistice Agreement is an official arrangement, an official agreement to end the state of war and move toward a state of peace. And it is an international norm related not only to the 2 Koreans, but also to the United States and China. This Armistice Agreement did not place a military demarcation line in the sea, but designated the 3 nautical miles as the exclusive jurisdictional zone of South and North Korea in border waters in the West Sea and left the rest of waters open for both Koreas. The keynote of the Declaration for Peace in the West Sea, as we suggest, is to reduce exclusive jurisdiction by both South and North Korea, but to expand the area waters for joint use by the 2 Koreas in accordance with the Armistice Agreement. To be more specific, the plan called for reducing territorial waters of the 2 Koreas to 3 nautical miles in the agreed area where hostile acts should be seized between the area south of Jodo in North Korea and north of Dokjokdo in South Korea, and converting the remaining whole waters into peace and cooperation zone. The Northern Limit Line NLL is maintained as the Northern Limit Line for South Korean repatriation activities as it was before. Let me touch upon the proposed declaration of peace in the West Sea. Nearly 70 years after the Armistice Agreements of the Korean War were signed, the situation on the Korean Peninsula is still unstable. In particular, conflicts between 2 Koreas in the West Sea, the sacrifice and casualties of soldiers and civilians, and restrictions on basic rights of local residents continue. The leaders of South and North Korea share the common view on such problems that an agreement on special zone and peace and cooperation in West Sea in October 1st declaration was made during the Roh Moo-hyun administration, and that an agreement was made in the Panmunjom Declaration to cease on hostile acts against each other in every domain, including the sea, under the current Moon Jae-in administration. Furthermore, the leaders of 2 Koreas agreed to establish a Maritime Peace Zone and a joint fishing zone in the West Sea, but unfortunately, it has yet been implemented in practice. The settlement of peace on the Korean Peninsula and reconciliation and cooperation between 2 states, North and South Korea, are national talks that cannot be delayed for peaceful survival of all of the residents of the 2 Koreas. The leaders of 2 Koreas agreed to push for an end of war declaration on the Korean Peninsula, as they shared the view that this armistice system on the Korean Peninsula would be implemented as a peace regime. In support of such inter-Korean agreement for peace on the Korean Peninsula, it is believed that establishment of the permanent peace regime on the Korean Peninsula can begin with the peaceful settlement in the waters off the 5 islands in the West Sea. With that in mind, we propose Inter-Korean Declaration of Peace in the West Sea. We anticipate that it will be used as a reference and supported by future political and military negotiations between 2 Koreas, domestic registration for peace in the West Sea, and domestic and overseas peace movement. Let me touch upon the Framework Act on Peace in the waters around the 5 islands in the West Sea. The Act consists of 7 chapters and 26 articles. In compliance with the Armistice Agreement, the purpose of this Act is to establish peace in the waters of the 5 islands in the West Sea, promoting inter-Korean relations and operation, and ensuring rights and interests of local residents. For the purpose of the Act, the waters around the 5 islands in the West Sea are defined as the area south of the North Korea's Jodo and north of South Korea's Dokjokdo again, and which was agreed in the Panmunjom Declaration and referred to the waters south of the NLL in the West Sea under South Korea's jurisdiction. Provisions of this Act shall be without prejudice to any of the previous agreements on the waters around the 5 islands in the West Sea between South and North Korea. This Act shall prevail over other laws and methods concerning the settlement of peace in the waters of Five Islands in the West Sea and promotion of the inter-Korea relations and cooperation and ensuring the rights and interests of the local residents. How about the Framework Act on the management of waters around the Five Islands in the West Sea? This proposed act is comprised of the 7 chapters in 24 articles. It is the same as the Framework Act on Peace, but there are differences in some provisions, as this act includes measures that can be realized without a binding agreement between South and North Korea. So far, various agreements covering the ideal items have been made between two Koreas, but the performance of such agreements have not been sustained due to the changes in the political situation. Therefore, we need to enact or implement practical measures necessary to establish peace on the Korean Peninsula. How about legislative the process of the waters surrounding the Five Islands in the West Sea? Various water areas in the West Sea are bound to have inherent limitation in their legal status because they are regulated by the international law, such as the United Nations Convention Law of the Sea, Korea-China Fisheries Agreement, the Armistice Agreement, as well as domestic laws of the two Koreas and China. The main emphasis of policy on each water zone can vary depending on the purpose of the zone, such as the protection of fishing resources and safety of navigation and military security. The Korea-China maritime border has not been delimited, and the two Koreas are still in confrontation with each other, as the northern limit line has been set up around the Five Islands in the West Sea. Based on thorough understanding of the legal status of the waters surrounding Five Islands in the West Sea, there is a need to take more determined or forward-looking approach to legislation consisting Declaration of Peace in the West Sea and Framework Act of Peace and the Framework Act of the Management of the Five Islands in the West Sea. I'm going to give you a wrap-up for this week's video lecture. The Korean Peninsula remains as the last coastal zone in the world. This fact is not something that Korea should be proud of. There should be a call for awareness of changing the South and North situation from a hostile zero-sum relationship into a plus-sum relationship of peace to pass on a better environment for future generations. There should be a consistent effort to pave the way to work with North Korea to realize the national interests of the peace and for practical benefits. To pursue this goal, there should be an approach that takes into account the interests of others. Take a lesson from another conflict, it is apparent that hostilities in the face of national interest is very, very meaningless.